Moment. I'm going to do my best to stay focused in this, but there's a lot that I would like to share. Um, and again, I find the metal element so complex and fascinating. There's just a lot of material that we could explore. And the first thing I thought about was um, this story that I remember hearing years ago. And it's a story about a Zen monk, and this young monk asks his teacher, "What's the most important practice?" And the teacher doesn't answer immediately, and he looks at the monk for a long time, and then he responds, "To remember that you will die." And the room becomes very quiet, and the monk feels uneasy and unsettled. And the teacher then continues, "When you truly remember death, your priorities rearrange themselves. You stop wasting time, you stop speaking carelessly, you stop postponing what matters. You stop pretending that you have forever." You know, I think especially as we get into our middle age, I don't know how old you all are, but you start this illusion that you have endless time, infinite time starts to become that bubble gets popped. We start to be closer to our mortality and to the awareness that we don't have infinite time, especially when you've kind of passed over the halfway mark. And I think most people live as if tomorrow is promised. But real practice, real cultivation begins when we realize that it isn't. Tomorrow is not promised. And not to bring too much solemnness to this talk, but I had a close childhood friend who I was close to her in high school, a very dear friend, and we haven't remained close over the years. But she was married with two young kids and lived in Marin. And she was one of the 8 women caught in this avalanche a couple days ago, and she didn't make it out, and she was only 42 years old. And, we live our lives psychologically and emotionally as if we have endless time. And real practice, real practice begins when you take time out of the picture. You come into contact with what's essential in life. Another way of putting it is stop pretending, you know? Enough is enough. And there, Lao Tzu, is important in Taoism. He wrote the Tao Te Ching, or didn't write it, conveyed it. There's a quote in the Tao Te Ching, which is, "He who knows he has enough is rich." Um, when we stop pretending, then we know what enoughness is. In our modern culture, we are constantly performing. I'm not saying all of you, but I think it's true of all human beings to some degree. We say, "How are you?" "I'm great." "How are you?" "I'm great." There's a certain layer of artifice in human relationships and interactions. We often interact automatically on autopilot, and we curate ourselves, and we postpone honesty because it can be uncomfortable. And metal energy cuts through all that. It cuts through illusion. Metal does not perform well-being. It values what's real. So if you're grieving, grieve. If you're uncertain, be uncertain. If you're called, take action. That is integrity. And that's really the integrity of the metal element is no bullshit. Um, and so, you know, when we have a relationship to death and to mortality, then we get really honest. You start living very honestly with integrity in life. And that's a bit of what I'm going to talk about today is this type of integrity and this type of clarity and honesty with oneself. And then I'll relate it to relationships. So, metal governs the lungs, which is the breath, That's why we focus on the breath a lot in the meditation, and in the autumn especially, which is related to the metal. It's good to do breath work, to really open the lungs and work with the lungs, to let go of grief and to move through layers of the lungs, especially because in the autumn we tend to do shadow work during this time of the year. And shadow work is confrontational by nature and by design. You're bringing all the material that you've denied, repressed, or avoided to the surface. And breath work is what can really help us move through that material. The breath is there at birth, and the breath is there, the last breath is at death. Like the heartbeat, it is always there. And our entire nervous system is managed through the breath. Relationships are so much about the nervous system. Metal also governs the large intestines, and the large intestines are about letting go, making space in the body, letting go what no longer serves you. So with metal energy, we're bringing in fresh inspiration into the lungs, opening the chest, opening up, but we're also letting go. And if we don't let go of things because we hold on to them, we cling to them, we're too attached to them, there's no space for what's new to come in. And that's really the core teaching of metal energy. In the autumn, the trees don't resist the falling of the leaves. There's the cutting away of the leaves. Things fall, they decay, they end. It doesn't assume more time, you know? This letting go is a natural part of life. It's a natural part of nature. But all of those leaves and all the foliage that falls becomes the fertilizer for the spring. If we don't let things go, we cannot grow. There will be no growth in the spring. And people cling and hold on to and are attached to their stories, their identities, their relationships, their ideas, their roles, and they cling to them so hard because they feel safe or familiar that they never make space for anything new to come in. And then they wonder why their lives feel stagnant or they're repeating the same patterns over and over again. So metal energy removes the illusion of later. When you stop assuming that you have more time, then clarity comes. You know, loss, the metaphoric falling of the leaves, loss is inevitable in life. It is part of life. But integrity is not inevitable. And metal energy is about integrity. It's that uprightness. We must live so that loss reveals integrity, not regret. When you lose cleanly, when you end a relationship, when you leave a job, when you let go of something in a clean way, you're doing it from a place of integrity to yourself. And if you maintain that integrity, it doesn't mean you won't experience grief or difficulty, but that integrity grows, right? And that's what it means to lose cleanly. And when we do it that way, we don't stay stuck in regret, right? Most people I know, myself included, one of my biggest fears is getting to the end of my life and having regret about the way I lived. You know, the thing is that what is inevitable is that we are all definitely going to die. But that doesn't mean that we're all going to live. And so many people live unlived lives, right? And then they end up with regret at the end. So when you stay true to your integrity and you remove time from the picture, what is integrity now? What needs to be let go of? Then we are strengthening that integrity. Taking time out of the picture is the medicine of metal. It's how we work with metal really well. So I want to talk a little bit about metal in nature. It's the autumn, but I also, as I describe metal in nature, I want you to think about personality types and physiology, because of course human beings are nature. We evolved in nature, from nature, as nature. So it's the autumn, it's the west, the setting sun. The climate is dry and cool. The earth contracts in the fall. It becomes cool and dry. The movement of the chi in the body and also in nature is inwards and descending, right? It's the autumn. It's that time of moving inwards. The lungs and the large intestine in the body. The emotion that governs metal, as well as the lungs, is grief. If you think about somebody crying, they can't catch their breath. It's the grief affects the lungs. If somebody stays in chronic grief, like they can't get over a relationship or something, their shoulders start to collapse, and that's the lung chi collapsing, right? Somebody who's got metal that's collapsed, they start to move inwards. This is the energy. It's sullenness and withdrawal. You can see it in the face, in the eyes, and the body, right? Somebody with grief, their shoulders are folded in. Too much grief. Now, the virtue of metal is integrity. It's what's called yi in Chinese. And in nature, again, we see the leaves detach without resistance. But when everything falls in nature, there's more spaciousness. You can see clearly. Also in the autumn, there's this kind of holy light. There's a very special light. It's almost like a twilight, you know? Um, Sap in trees and plants withdraws back to the roots. Everything moves back to the source. The air becomes very crisp and sparse and clean. There's a purity and cleanliness to the autumn, to the air and to the light and to the temperature and the feeling. And colors tend to intensify before they disappearing, right? That I love in the autumn is to really notice the light, the quality of the light. Um, and the earth becomes very cool and dry and reserved, right? It's a time of holding. And you can notice this in people with a metal element type and constitution. So this time in the autumn is about refinement and everything unnecessary falls away. The falling leaves become compost, and metal energy teaches the power of subtraction to what's essential, to distillation, distilling the essence, to refinement. You could think of it as the alchemist. Alchemists are very metal types. Chemists, alchemists, they're about distilling and refining, or like a queen. Because metal is yin, it's more feminine, but it's also dignified, right? It's dignified and elegant and clean. And so this archetype of the queen is appropriate to it. Now, I thought of this quote from The Little Prince, which it's from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince. I read it to my son recently. And the quote is, "Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away." Um, I like this idea, the idea of subtraction. Or I think like Michelangelo's David, right? He has some quote about when he was carving it. He said, "I wasn't the statue was already in the stone. I just removed what wasn't there, you know?" Um, and this is kind of the way that metal energy works. It's what needs to be removed, let go of, subtracted, refined, distilled, dropped. In metal personality types, to recognize them, metal people appreciate simplicity and grace. They also often dress with clean lines. Their homes are orderly. They're very zen. Zen is very metal. They're composed. Their presence is composed. They're not loud. There's a quiet gravity and grace to metal people. They move kind of quietly through the world. They're not chaotic. They're clear. And oftentimes metal people have like a svelte body, they're like slender and tall and elegant, sometimes high cheekbones. Um, but metal shows up more in the way that a person holds themselves than in the shape of their face or their body. It's a quality of composure and uprightness and presence, right? Um, Metal types, they really value truth over comfort. And that can feel cold, for example, to an earth type or a fire type. They're very sensitive to hypocrisy, which when it's unhealthy, they can be critical, you know? They prefer depth to drama. High emotions are not interesting to metal people. They don't want to engage. Um, or loud emotions. They often can have a lot of emotional depth, but they don't want loud emotions. They're there for depth. And they hold very strong internal standards. And when it's unhealthy, it can be perfectionism, an impossible perfectionism that becomes critical, including self-critical, right? So the kind of questions that they naturally ask are, is this clean in a relationship, emotionally, energetically, ethically? Is it essential? Is this aligned? Oftentimes, metal people can appear reserved, their temperament, but often they feel very deeply. So that being reserved or composed can become a type of protectiveness, a self-protection because of how deeply they feel. And oftentimes with metal people, you can feel this incredible depth of emotion beneath the surface, but it's not showing on the surface, right? So metal governs value. If you think about metal in terms of rubies, gems, sapphires, golds, precious metals, it's an exchange of value. And when the metal element's healthy in a person, worth is intrinsic. You feel your intrinsic value and worth, the dignity of being a human being. Whereas when metal is wounded, for example, if somebody didn't develop healthy self-worth as a child, and oftentimes that's because the father didn't acknowledge worth in the child, um, then worth becomes performance, right? It becomes performative. Healing those self-worth issues begins when you stop trying to earn something that's already inherent. So people who have unhealed metal energy, they're always trying to prove something instead of existing in that upright dignity of their humanity. And so the healing happens when we stop trying to prove something. There's nothing to prove. You know, we're already whole and complete as is. I want to talk a little bit about metal integrity, and I have some other things I want to get to. So if I'm moving rapidly, it's because there's things that are important for me to get to. I talked a lot about integrity with wood and earth, but they're different in the context of relational language. Um, Wood element, because it's all about facing everything, it says, I won't ignore this tension. Wood has to address things, right? Um, Whereas earth says, I won't abandon you. Earth is the caretaker, right? That's what integrity means, is to caretake. Whereas metal says, I won't betray myself. And, I remember reading about this in Laurie Deschar and thinking about it. And I was trying to understand, like, are metal people self-focused? Are they self-absorbed? And I thought about or what I realized was what they're really saying in I won't betray myself is I won't pretend. It's about authenticity, which is really important to metal. And because metal is yin, it's internally referential. It checks inward before acting outward. But that is different than self-absorption. If a metal person becomes too self-focused, then I won't betray myself becomes I won't risk myself. And that can be self-protective and very avoidant. So in terms of attachment theory, metal types can tend towards avoidance and withdrawal. But that comes out of fear, not out of the essence of metal energy. The essence of metal energy is about authenticity and integrity, right? And so they're checking internally, does this feel aligned? Does this feel ethical? Does it feel true to my values before they act? Um, but again, if they aren't willing to take a risk or if there's wounding, the wounded metal energy can withdraw and be avoidant, and they won't take risk, even if it would be healthy to open up, even if that would be a good way to interact with others. So when the metal energy becomes distorted, integrity becomes judgment and criticism, right? I know a number of highly intelligent metal types who are critical, right? And they don't even realize that they're a bit critical. They kind of feel like they're floating above, and they can look down on others. Or if it's turned inwards, they look down on themselves, and that gets into that self-worth piece. Their standards can become very rigid. When metal gets too hard, too solid, it's rigid. Their boundaries, because metal is all about boundaries. The lung energy governs the opening and closing of the pores of the skin, and your skin is the boundary between the external and the internal. So metals boundaries are very important and respecting boundaries. But if metal is distorted, those boundaries turn into armor. Um, and metal types can become isolated. They can withdraw. They can close down and shut down. And, if you look into the work of Wilhelm Reich, he was an interesting man, a psychoanalyst who was a contemporary of Freud. And I won't go into that because I won't get to the rest of the things, but he talked a lot about these layers of armoring that we develop in childhood. And we have such a performative culture that we live in now that when we carry false pretense or false facade, that is a form of armoring, right? Um, and the last thing is that the refinement of metal, another archetype is like the yogi. They can live very simply. They don't need any material things. They just are looking to achieve total enlightenment, but ultimately it's about refinement, so the yogi archetype is in there too. But unhealthy refinement turns into superiority and criticism, you know? So there are a lot of metal types, for example, in academia. You can think about them. They live so in their heads that they become kind of distanced from their humanity. The deeper fear that can happen with metal is if I open fully, I may be disappointed or disappointing. So in relationships, there's this fear of being disappointed or disappointing somebody. And that has to do with those standards, you see? So, all right, I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 10 minutes, but I haven't gotten to important things, so I'll do my best. So, how metal gives love is through loyalty over time. They're very loyal. They stay true to their integrity, to their principles, their values, through honest speech, right? They are sparing with their language, and their word is important to them. Through emotional steadiness, through protecting the integrity of a bond. So they will, in relationships, come back to what's essential and true in a relationship. And again, this could be friendship, familial relationships, etc. But what's important to them is the integrity of the relationship and a refined, quiet attentiveness, quiet attention. If you think about metal in terms of like swords and knives and things, it does have a quality of principles, right? People who go to war for their beliefs. That's an example of that metal quality. But in relationships, metal doesn't love loudly. It protects quietly. It's more about protecting. Um, it says, I won't betray this connection, this relationship, as long as there's integrity here. So again, integrity is so central to metal. Now, the way that metal receives love, receives care, receives in relationship is when their boundaries are respected, right? So boundaries are really important to metal people. When their solitude is honored, and when there is sincerity over performance. What they want is sincerity, and they can detect it, right? If something is off. So that quality of sincerity and integrity is important. They want to be met in depth. Metal can be they can be deep people. And because grief is very natural for metal people, they don't want their grief to be rushed. They need to process things, right? They need space. Again, spaciousness is that quality of the autumn. They need space to breathe. And, in terms of some of the other elements, fire can be overwhelming for metal people. Too much wood is that pressure, right? Wood tends to push boundaries because it wants to grow, but that can be received as pressure for metal. And too much chaos or passion feels unsafe. So that's not the type of relatedness that metals tend to gravitate towards. Now, I had this other quote I found that from Viktor Frankl, the psychologist, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he wrote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. So metal lives in that space, right? They the ability for choice and volition and the spaciousness to feel, am I aligned with this, is really important to a metal type. That's where they live. Now, again, when metal becomes distorted, when it's not healthy, and you can look for this in yourself, or you can look for this in other metal people who you know in your life, they'll withdraw instead of processing something difficult. They'll emotionally contain, but it's a form of armoring. They won't face things. Their high standards or their perfectionism becomes it can block intimacy and letting people in. Or, for example, in a relationship, it could be like symbolic intimacy, symbolic connection. So they could talk about things and talk about intimacy, but when it comes to actual intimacy, they can't let that guard down, let that armoring down. Um, and they might leave a difficult situation or a relationship before being left. And that comes from this belief that if they're not fully available, then they won't get hurt because they were never fully committed, right? So this is an avoidant attachment style where if they haven't committed all the way, then they won't get hurt. And this isn't true, right? Because really they're becoming unavailable based on a false belief, on a false pretense. And that tends to be even more hurtful, I think, over time. I know I've experienced that in previous relationships. Um, so also metal types, because it's about the breath, the giving and receiving, Earth does that very naturally. But in metal, it can look like mixed signals. So, when people kind of vacillate a lot, they can't quite make up their mind. They say one thing, they do another. They're warm in conversations, but they're distant in their bodies. They're not very metals aren't very physically touchy people, right? But unless it's healthy, unless there's the warmth of kind of fire and earth to come in, there can be emotional depth, but then physical shutdown. So intimacy can be challenging for metals. It's a lot about boundaries. And then they can move towards intimacy, but then they'll subtly retreat, right? And why does that happen? It happens because metal wants closeness, but it fears disillusionment. Um, where woods struggle with conflict, they want to confront things, but they're afraid of conflict. And earth fears disconnection, right? Earth types are all about reciprocity. Metal fears disappointment. So this disappointment and grief are things that are difficult for metal types. When closeness becomes real, The breath can shorten, the chest can tighten, and desire can retract. And that's the somatic contraction of the Po. And the Po is the spirit of the metal element. But as the Rumi quote came to mind, the wound is the place where the light enters you, right? So the mature or the evolved version of metal says, I feel myself closing. Let me breathe more deeply into that. This matters enough to risk. And the risk is exposure. It's putting the armor down, it's risking exposure, and it's you working with the breath to open, right? So the Po is the Po is the spirit of the metal element. It's the coming and going that when we die in Taoism, they say the Po spirit dissolves. It's one of the insubstantial, it's like air or wind. It's an insubstantial spirit, and it lives in the breath. It governs our physical instincts. If you think about the nervous system and the breathing, it's the animal, it's connected to the animal body, right? It's our instincts, and it's connected to boundaries, and it's connected to breathing, to the nose. Think about how the nose is connected to your instincts. Think about a wolf in the forest, like how in its body it is, right? So this somatic, instinctive nervous system feeling, like this is very much metal energy. It's connected to boundaries and safety and instincts, right? And that's the part of metal that is not intellectual. It's very instinctive. Um, a healthy Po is embodied presence. So instead of it just being instincts, we're also bringing the conscious awareness into the physical body so that there's presence and awareness along with this refined sensitivity of the instincts. And it has clear limits. So it's aware of boundaries without needing to be armored and boundaried all the time. When the Po is disturbed, when it's not healthy, people experience chronic grief. There's always a feeling of grief around them or some sadness, some heaviness. And that can turn into numbness. These people tend to cling to the past. So you remember when we talked about the wood element, it's all about like the life you're creating and the vision and moving forward and expansion. And whereas a disturbed Po, it just gets stuck in the past. Its life becomes organized around wounds, injustices, um, the sadness of life, the grief, the difficulty of samsara. It can just stay in that grief. And the medicine of metal is the breath, right? It's inhaling and receiving something new and fresh, exhaling, letting go, letting go. So healthy metal types, they know when to let go and they know when to take in what's new. I think Thich Nhat Hanh is one of the great, profound teachers who passed away, in recent years. Incredible, really a Zen master. And he wrote, breath is the bridge which connects life to consciousness. And, the breath, even though it seems like the simplest thing, working with the breath consciously, again, it's what connects life to consciousness. If somebody only has one spiritual practice, it's just awareness of the breath, moment by moment by moment, and learning how to receive and to release. You know, we are dying and being reborn every moment. And that is freshness. That's beginner's mind, right? Every moment is new. All right, I'm going to go over by 3 more minutes. So thank you for staying with me for an extra 10 minutes. Um, the thing that I want to touch on. Okay. I'll send in the email this week a little bit more about how metal interacts with the other elements. but I'm going to go deep into that next week. So the final class next week is going to be all about how all the elements work with each other to try to create a holographic picture. Um, but the kind of final insight is working with grief as reverence. So, metal teaches that grief is not weakness, that grief is learning to live with reverence. If you're at a funeral, something becomes very clear. No one talks about like productivity or status or pettiness. Like, what do people talk about if you think about a funeral you've been to? We remember, we remember the person's laugh, the way that they listened, the ordinary moments that were really sacred with that person, right? Everything comes into high definition about the truth of your relationship to that person when they die. And grief, which is what happens at funerals, it strips away everything non-essential and it reveals what matters. It shows us what we value and what's important to us. And so instead of avoiding grief, when we allow ourselves, when it's appropriate to feel it, it shows us what we revere. It shows us what matters to us in our lives. It shows us our values. And, you know, that grief also can show us our attachment. And like in Buddhism, right? Like attachment is suffering and desire is suffering and everything. But I think there's something beautiful about attachment because it reveals what we love. And, you know, when working with the metal element, that our grief refines our love, the way that we love. You know, when you feel your breath, when you connect with your breath and you're present, at a funeral, for example, you realize, oh, this life is temporary. And this kind of goes back to the opening thing I was talking about in this class. Suddenly, life becomes precious when you realize it's temporary, when you realize it not abstractly, but immediately. Oh, this moment, this life, these relationships, you're no longer living just in your head or conceptually or abstractly. And that teaches us to live more fully, more truly, with reverence. It teaches us reverence. So, a question I want to leave you with today is where in life are you holding on, not because it is right, but because you are afraid to feel the grief that would reveal what truly matters? I'm going to repeat it one more time. Where in your life are you holding on, not because it's right, but because you're afraid to feel the grief that would reveal what truly matters? So I realize it's a little bit of a nuanced question. It's kind of layered, but you can sit with it if you want. This answering that question is the dignity of metal. It's the integrity and dignity of metal. It's kind of funny in teaching these classes. I've noticed as I'm talking about it that I start feeling the quality of the element. Um, and making your experience to the elements non-abstract is the intention of this work, so that you can begin to see them in yourself and others, right? I used to lead these 5 element retreats. They were 7-day retreats up here in Telluride. And on the day of the element, it would be amazing how the elements started to just come in and work through the entire retreat. We usually had 25, 30 people at them. And like on the Earth Day, everybody's in community and sharing and reciprocating and helping each other. And on the wood day, everybody's like talking about their plans in life and their vision it's not conscious. It was just in the field, right? So these elements are dancing through our lives. They're who and what we are. They're the building blocks of nature, and they're the building blocks of our psyche, our emotional life, our physical life, and the spirits and Taoism of the organs. It's how qi and blood move through the body, right? They're as intimate as the breath. Um, and a lot of the intention of working with them in these relationship contexts is learning how to to navigate them in a way that we can live more skillfully, to cultivate wisdom. I think that's the one thing that's really lacking nowadays, wisdom. So, all right, I will stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions or anything they want to share. Um, we made it through all five elements, and so next week we'll bring them together. And I also wanted to mention that some folks have reached out asking a lot of questions and they really want to go deeper into an element or understand something more. And so I'm offering one-on-one sessions to explore those more deeply and learning how to navigate the elements and specifically talking to people about their own elemental makeup, how they're navigating them in their lives, maybe things that they're working through in this moment, and also suggestions around dietary things and herbs and kind of customizing elemental work with people. So if that's something that appeals to you, then where I think it's on the website now, you can sign up. I have very limited time at the moment because Living Tea, we just started a big fundraising round. We're moving into this next phase of the company. And so my schedule's quite full, but I'll be seeing a couple people a week. And if that's something that appeals to you, then feel free to reach out. Um, and, working with the seasonal tea club is like I put a lot of thought and time into the tea club and I pick teas and I write a pretty extensive write-up on the element of the season. That's a good way if you want to incorporate teas and work with teas elementally. Um, we're in our eighth year with that tea club, so it's established and kind of been refined over those 8 years. So if that's something that appeals to you, you could work with the elements in that way. Um, I think those are the main things. Um, yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll stick around and drink some tea for a minute.
Hey,
Hi, Scott.
so I have heard you say in other classes that in addition to our core and sub elements, there can be another element that your shadow works within. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yep.
And then I'm hearing in this class that metal is sort of inherently connected to shadow work and its season being autumn and all the things that you named. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, yeah, how does that relate to like if your shadow is expressing more through fire? Like, how does that connect to this?
Sure. Um, so there is historical precedence to suggest that people throughout history have worked with the elements in their season, right? Like Taoist practitioners. There's 8 big energy days through the year where yin and yang are transforming, where the veil is thin, so to speak, where we really work to be quiet or to cultivate the energy of the season. Um, and there are a lot of practitioners I know who really work to cultivate and work on the element during its season. That's particularly important with shadow work, I feel like, because okay, so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is the way I work with the elements seasonally is deeply personal, meaning that like I developed a way of working with them that makes the most sense to me, and and now I'm sharing it and teaching it to people. But it's not like I'm following this is the clear sky tradition of this school or lineage of Taoism, and this is the way we do it. So I'm sharing my approach, and it's what's worked for me, so to speak. Um, Shadow work in the autumn, when we look at, so the first thing I want to say is we don't stay in shadow work all year round or all the time. I've seen this a lot in different groups of people where they discover shadow work. They realize they have some epiphany because they see, like, oh my God, I have this denied or repressed material or this thing I haven't looked at, or they start doing some inner child work and they're like, I've never seen that thing, or wow, my relationship with so and so has impacted my whole life. And it's such a big realization that they've had these patterns or maybe a protective mechanism or some issue that they've had for 20 years, and then they trace it back to some childhood dynamic, right? And it's such a big, it feels like this earth-shattering insight, and then they just keep staying in shadow work, and it's a little bit like in psychoanalysis, where you can work with your therapist for 20 years and you're just talking over the same pattern over and over and over again, without anything actually shifting, anything transforming, right? And the ego loves that because the ego loves experience. And the ego's like, we're doing work, and it's, as I joke around and say, one more ayahuasca sit, one more breathwork session, one more meditation retreat, one more third eye activation, and we just think the ego loves it because it feels good. I'm working on myself. And shadow work can be the same thing. We can just keep staying in there, and it's like picking at a scab. You're just you stay in the wound. And real metal work, it's kind of a combination of metal and wood energy together, is take time out of the picture, right? It's like I talked about in this class. You're gonna die. You don't have infinite time. Like the change that needs to happen, do it now. Stop now. Drop that habit now. If you need to let go of something, do it now. And oftentimes, when there's wounding in the metal element around self-worth, the person thinks they don't deserve at an unconscious level, at a shadow level, I don't deserve X life, or I don't deserve that person or that change or whatever. So they won't let go of this thing. Or there's fear, so it's the inability to get out the samurai sword and whoosh, done, moving on, right? Or if it's shadow in the wood element, it's an unwillingness to start the thing that they know they need to start to live an authentic life or to face that thing, right? So so I recommend shadow work in the fall and then bringing that even deeper into the stillness of the winter and water element and really facing the deepest fears in the water element. Because otherwise, I've just seen people stay in this kind of like shadow work phase for like years, literally. They're always working on something. You probably know people like this. I was one of those people at one point, really more in my 20s, but I was always working on something and going to another fucking workshop, excuse my language. And it was kind of like, what's this wound underneath that I think once I have this experience, once I do this thing, once I meditate enough, whatever, then I'll be whole. Then I'll experience my inherent worth. Then I'll finally be, whatever it is. But it's coming from a not enoughness place. Not enough, not adequate, not meditating hard enough, you know? And so it you can just get kind of stuck in this myopic focus on the wound, on the childhood wound. Mom wasn't loving enough. Dad didn't acknowledge me enough. Uncle Bob said I was stupid. Whatever. We can just stay stuck. And so it is good to acknowledge and work with healing around those wounds, looking at repressed material, looking at anything we disapprove of or deny in ourselves. But we don't want to stay there, right? At a certain point, we have to also work with wood energy and fire energy, which is now what? What is the life you are authoring? What is this vision of what you want to create? Where does creativity and beauty and vision and growth and emergence and self-authorship that, in the introductory class, I talked about eros and agape. Where does that eros and that life force want to move? And so we allow it to come forth. We take the risk of relationship. We take the risk of being exposed, of connecting, of opening up. And so to answer your question fully, you can each of the elements has a shadow quality, right? An example would be a person with a lot of fire energy, fire element, which is all about connection and vulnerability and emotional connection and intimacy and spark. It's the spark of connection, right? Fire wants to connect. But the shadow of that is using that connection as a mode of control. Another shadow um, of fire would be victim consciousness, right? And I'm not going to get into extracting all that right now. I talked about it in the fire class, but each element has a distorted version of itself. Um, and a person could have a healthy elemental expression, but then under stress or under duress, collapse into its distorted version, right? So I think the thing that's important now is to see like if you want to set aside a specific time for shadow work, I recommend doing it more in the shadow season, right? The metal grows in caves. Think precious metals, what's under the earth, what's unseen, what's in the unconscious. What am I not looking at? Um, I that's like I've got 96 questions that are designed around the five elements, and Shannon and I are figuring out how to organize those so that you can work with one every 4 days throughout the course of a year. We're like developing that. But focusing on shadow work in the fall is very effective. Being aware that there is shadow in each of the elements is helpful because we're wanting to develop a non-abstract, um, clear view of how the elements function. But my recommendation is to work with your element now and to work on observing it in other people as the first phase. Once this course ends, I'm going to do a sit every Saturday morning and it's just Q&A. So we're going to meditate and then just open up the conversation for it to be an open, let's drink some tea and talk. And I'd like for it to be kind of around the elements, but if you stay with that for, if you come, not every Saturday necessarily, but and bring your questions and what you're observing, it will allow for this to evolve. It's not like we just finished this course and it's like, good luck out there, you know? Um, so this is meant to be, it took me really about a decade to feel like, oh, this is breathed for me. I see it all the time. Like I see elements everywhere. They are, um, they're not even a map or a lens. It's just my experience of reality. And so, you know, it's not meant to be figured out intellectually. It's meant to, you have a framework, you stay open to it, and then you let life start talking to you, start to see it, right? I don't know if that answered your question, probably in there. There was something hopefully that pointed in a direction, but something I'm encouraging is not to make this too intellectual. Try to breathe it and just say, like, okay, I have a flavor. Let me just see how it starts showing up and if I can bring my attention to it as I notice the movement of energy in different moments.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's all so helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like an important distinction that I was hearing from you is like, yeah, just this difference of actually like doing shadow work versus simply having these like subs that we collapse into, but it's not necessarily about like dissecting those every time and more restoring, right? Through like my core is earth and my sub that I got on the quiz, and I feel that it's accurate, is that I can lean into wood excess or metal deficiency. And I feel like, yeah, I was asking this because I'm curious of like, is there some wounds I need to be looking at all the time to like fix these things? And I'm hearing that that's not true. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I do want to say one thing in response to that,
Yeah.
which is everything we're talking about here is yin and yang. It's the transition of yin and yang. It's the spinning of that wheel. You can't have yin without yang. You can't have yang without yin. And when we look at yin or agape or the womb, the container, that like water metal energy, we are talking about the unconscious and having a creative relationship to the unconscious. It's also to the dimension in the self of emptiness. And there is this dimension of the self rooted in emptiness, rooted in impermanence, rooted in transformation that is unwounded, unvictimized, disabused, untraumatized, has no problem ever, and is this vast field of unconditionality, vast field of unconditional love. This dimension of the self, of emptiness, is what we cultivate when we have no relationship to the content of consciousness, to the mind, the emotions doing their thing in meditation, when we sit in stillness and we say, and we connect with the field of awareness, of pure consciousness, within which all of our emotions and all of our thoughts and all of our experiences arise and fall like birds in the sky, right? And we don't identify with all of that. That's not who we are.
Mm.
Thoughts and emotions and feelings and ideas and identities, those are phenomena. They're subtle phenomena. Thoughts are subtle phenomena, but they're no more real than a rock in the driveway. You don't pull into your driveway and say, "Ah, that rock is me. There I am, the rock." You just see it as an object in awareness. In cultivating meditation, daily practice, we are learning to disidentify with those thoughts and feelings as me. I, me, my thoughts, my feelings, etc. The more we can step into that quality of emptiness, the more we are connected to the dimension of the self that is untraumatized, unwounded, unvictimized, right? We can see all of those experiences as aspects of the ego. We can see the conditioning, the superego, the cultural conditioning, the introjections, the things that we have taken in to be, oh, this is who I am, as just explorations. Is this true? Is this really who I am? Where did that come from? From my parents, from my education, my society, whatever. It's not me. So that's cultivating that yin energy, that metal and that water energy is the capacity to sit in emptiness, unwounded. When we're working with wood and fire energy, then we're stepping into the creative self-authorship. Okay, then who am I? You get to decide. You're not a victim. You can author your life. You can determine who you are. You can determine what your values are. You can determine actions that align with your values, integrity, authenticity, etc. So within all of that, in that work, sure, in the metal element, it's good to look at some wounds and to see your blocks and your attachments and your what you're protecting, what you're guarding, right? But ultimately, it's not who you are. Our wounds are not who we are. And so the question for me is really, how is this wound teaching me? Let's assume that there is some divine curriculum and you were given exactly what you needed to wake up. Exactly. the parents, the life circumstances, the difficulties, exactly what you needed to wake up. Then we begin to relate to our lives from a different, more holistic perspective, an integral perspective. So that's a little bit more meta on it, but this we can't rush through any of this. We just keep practicing, showing up, and recognizing life is giving us extraordinary opportunities every day to wake up.
Mm. Thank you. His
Yeah.
response brought tears to my eyes.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a question. Um, Firstly, hello, Sky. I love you. Um, and my question is about trust. And I was wondering if you could speak to um, working with trust and if you think the metal element is sort of the domain for maybe facing the unknown and having big life changes, maybe things needing to shift and let go of. Yeah, I'm curious your
Mm.
thoughts.
Yeah. So when we work with trust, we are really working with it's more water element. And what we're talking about, of course, like anything, there are levels of trust, right? So there's, for example, conditional trust, like in a relationship, any kind of relationship. There's trust that is built by honoring social agreements, essentially. And are those social agreements explicit, or are the social agreements assumed? Are they, made clear? Do we know what the person expects of us and what we expect of them? And do we honor that trust, which we build trust over time, right? And then if trust is violated, what does that mean? But what I feel like you're asking, and you can clarify if I'm not understanding, but is about basic trust. And basic trust is rooted in the water element, and it has to do with our relationship to the unknown. So, when do we not trust? Is another way of putting it. Or what gets in the way of our capacity to trust? If you've experienced a lot of difficulty or betrayal or deceit or things in life that have shaken your basic trust in life itself, in the life experience, then oftentimes we can unconsciously strategize in the way that we live our lives such that we're always protective because we don't trust. There's not a letting go. There's not a trusting the unknown. There's not a trusting the unfolding. When we look at water element energy, we're looking at our relationship to the unknown, to the great mystery, to the possibility or the truth that we have no idea what's going to happen, you know? And when you have what happens with water element energy is that if you put your stake in the ground, metaphorically, for I am here to evolve, I'm here to grow, I'm here to wake up. I was given this unique and profound and beautiful opportunity in a human body, a human incarnation, to wake up. And I am pure consciousness. Consciousness is not some abstract thing floating around out in the ether, but consciousness is my true identity. It's who and what I am. Then, from that perspective, the cultivation of consciousness, the evolution, I am a vehicle for the evolution of consciousness. When you put your stake in the ground and say, this is the core foundation of my life, is to evolve and to grow and to be a vehicle for consciousness, for the good, the true, and the beautiful, to be of service to humanity, then that basic trust becomes a different thing. Because what you're saying is any experience that comes to me is the movement of consciousness for my evolution and growth. The basis of this course, right, is the golden mirror. Everything that happens in relationships in our lives is a mirror that's showing you something. So if all of reality is a mirror, because we have this idea, I, me, and my, I'm going through my life and it's all about me and I'm thinking about me and da 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 da. When we open that field to recognize that this little self is not the whole picture, believe it or not, right? But that all of life is me, you know? We won't get into a philosophical conversation about what the self is at this moment, but that all of life is mirroring something back to me. It's showing me something moment by moment by moment. And you've put your stake in the ground for consciousness and evolution and to wake up. Then there's a foundational basic trust. Whatever comes, may it serve this evolutionary process. I trust it. I trust it. The thing about integrity in the metal element is you already know. You know in the body. If something needs to end, you know in the body. The body knows, the heart knows, the Shen knows. If something needs to end, it's just the mind and the ego that's afraid of the grief or the hurting somebody or the whatever. But you know, the body knows. This is why we have to cultivate a deeper, more intimate relationship to what is going on at these deeper levels. Or if you need to start something and you've been avoiding it, the body knows, you know. The body doesn't lie. It's it's always here and now. You know, the body doesn't time travel. It doesn't hang out in the future and the past. It's right here. And so we cultivate deeper sensitivity to what in this moment, where am I guided? You know, we're learning to follow the Tao here. We're learning to follow the river. Where does life want to take me? Where is it guiding me? What is it showing me? And really, it's about being curious, being interested, not hiding. What is this showing me? Staying open, right? What is it showing me? That's the foundation, I think, for the real deep trust, right? I trust this life. I trust this experience. If something's difficult, I trust it. What is it showing me? This is kind of a radical stance because it's a natural stance, but it's radical because what's being mirrored for most of society is posturing. How are you? I'm great. How are you? You know, it's just a lot of bullshit. And I'm not saying that if you're genuinely happy, you shouldn't express your happiness, but I'm saying that we have to be honest with ourselves. The most important thing I can say in response to your question is this. If you want to develop trust, real trust, become utterly trustworthy. If you are utterly trustworthy, you'll establish the foundation of trust that's unshakable. Don't worry about what other people do. I mean, you know what I mean. I don't mean that from an egoic sense. I mean, worry about your trustworthiness. That's the thing that matters. And that requires being honest with ourselves. So,
Thank you. That's a lot to chew on. Yeah, my reflection on that is like, feels like um, to be trustworthy with yourself is to kind of with the metal element to really distill um, your essence and what's left after maybe change passes through your life and yeah, what's essential.
yeah, what's essential? It's a great question. You know, what's essential? I mean, and trust me, as a wood type person, I do all sorts of shit that I do not need to be doing. I spend a lot of energy doing things that I don't need to be expending energy on, like, but that's part of creativity, it's part of like being interested in everything all at once, all the time. Is like ultimately we have to kind of sometimes get out that surgical knife and like be like, you can't do everything all the time. Like, what really matters? One of my teachers, Lonnie Jarrett, I asked him this question. I said, like, a couple weeks ago, I said, Lonnie, you are like a fourth degree black belt, a master guitarist. You've written three 1,200-page books that are the most profound thing I've ever read. You teach these classes. You had 45 years of clinical practice. Like the amount of things this man has done in his life is like impossible. And I said, how is it possible? I don't understand. And I get that you get up at 5:30 every morning and do a bunch of things, but like, I don't get it. And he said, Colin, I realized in my late 20s that I had this problem. He's also kind of a wood type, that I wanted to do all of it. I wanted everything. And I realized mastery was important to him. He didn't want to be a dilettante of 30 different things. And he said, I had to sit and really get true with what are the things I want to master. We're not going to master more than two or three things in a lifetime. What are the things that are hobbies, and what does that mean? How much attention I give to them? And what kind of relationships am I going to prioritize? And he said that clarified things. So he gives a lot of his energy to teaching students, but he doesn't maintain close personal relationships that are non-clinical relationships or patient, like clinician patient student, unless they are deeply spiritually nourishing. You know, he doesn't have time for it. He stopped trying to master the Chinese language, which, I'm studying Chinese right now, and I'm just like, good Lord, maybe if I can live to like 150, I'll be able to like speak elementary Chinese. But, it's like we just have to get clear about like, this is what matters to me. And one of the things I was going to talk about in the class today, and then I'll wrap this up because we're over quite a bit. But Brad Warner, who's like a punk rock musician, and he's written some great books on Zen. He's very cheeky, curses a lot. He said the essence of all spiritual teachings is this. Don't be a jerk and quit fucking around. And excuse my language for those of you who don't like that kind of language, but he's basically saying like, be kind, be compassionate. We're all suffering together. We're all having this life thing together. And then the second part is, are you clear on what your life is about? And what are you doing about it? Take time out of the picture. Um, you know, don't spend 2 hours a day scrolling Instagram. There's a lot of great things out there to spend your time on. So.